Hey everyone, and welcome to Medieval Nocturnes. Tonight, we're pulling back the velvet curtain on history to begin our journey into the bizarre, the baffling, and the utterly embarrassing final moments of those who were supposed to be the most dignified figures in the world. We're talking about royalty kings, queens, emperors, and empresses whose lives were filled with ceremony, power, and jewel-encrusted crowns. But death, as it turns out, has little respect for status. Before we begin our descent into these strange tales, if you find you enjoy our unique brand of quiet history, please consider subscribing to Medieval Nocturnes. Your support helps us continue to explore these forgotten corners of the past. Now, find a comfortable position, dim the lights, and let the world outside fade away. Let's begin our exploration of the most undignified ends in the annals of royalty. Our first story takes us to the cold north, to the court of King Adolf Frederick of Sweden. His story isn't one of battlefield glory or political assassination. Instead, his chapter in the great book of history ends with a rather unique title: Death by Desert. Of all the ways a monarch could depart this world, surrounded by weeping nobles or in a blaze of glory, King Adolf Frederick chose a path paved with pastry and regret. The fateful evening was in February of 1771. The king, perhaps feeling the winter chill or the weight of his crown, decided to indulge in a feast of epic proportions. The royal table groaned under the weight of lobster, caviar, mountains of sauerkraut, and smoked herring. To wash it all down, he enjoyed several glasses of champagne, enough to make even the stoic palace guards feel a bit lightheaded. But none of this, impressively, was the cause of his demise. The true culprit arrived after the main course, a seemingly innocent dessert known as the semla. For those unfamiliar, a semla is a traditional Swedish sweet roll, flavored with cardamom, filled with almond paste, and crowned with a cloud of whipped cream, often served floating in a bowl of warm milk. It's a rich, decadent treat, the kind where one is more than enough. King Adolf Frederick, however, consumed 14 of them. You can almost picture the scene in the grand dining hall, the servants watching in silent horror, their faces a mixture of awe and concern. Somewhere between the 10th and 13th serving, a brave attendant likely suggested that His Majesty might prefer a light stroll. But the king, with his spoon held high and a smudge of cream on his royal lips, was a man on a mission, determined to see it through to the very end. Later that evening, the inevitable happened. The king complained of severe stomach cramps, which quickly escalated into agonizing pain before he ultimately collapsed. The official royal record states that he passed away from digestive problems, which is perhaps the most polite and understated way of saying a man's love for pastry had finally consumed him in return. He had, quite literally, eaten himself into the afterlife. And so, the legacy of King Adolf Frederick was sealed. He is remembered not for his administrative reforms or his relatively peaceful reign, but as the monarch who was vanquished by a desert. There was no poison, no betrayal, no tragic illness, just a fatal overestimation of his stomach's capacity. In a strange way, there is a certain majesty in going out on one's own delicious terms. Most monarchs, if they have the luxury of contemplating their end, probably envision a scene of great ceremony, a grand deathbed farewell, a final, poignant breath whispered in Latin as a chamber orchestra plays softly in the adjoining room. King George II of Great Britain, however, was afforded no such dignity. His reign concluded not in a palace chamber, but on the royal toilet. Yes, you heard that correctly. The king's final moments were spent on his commode. It was the morning of October 25th, 1760. The king, already in his late 70s, awoke feeling slightly unwell, but proceeded with his morning rituals as usual. There was some light conversation with his attendants, a bit of royal grumbling about the affairs of state, and then, as is the custom for both kings and commoners, a private visit to the privy. His servants waited patiently outside the door for his return, but he never returned. After a few moments of silence, a loud thud was heard from within the chamber. His attendants, fearing the worst, rushed inside to find the monarch slumped over on the floor next to the chamber pot. He had suffered a sudden and catastrophic aortic aneurysm, a rupture of the body's main artery, and had died almost instantly. While his death was technically from natural causes, the location was, to put it mildly, unforgiving. Let's pause for a moment to truly appreciate the historical tableau. The King of Great Britain and Ireland, the Elector of Hanover, the supreme defender of the Anglican faith, meeting his Maker, not on a throne or a battlefield, but in the most compromising of positions. It is hardly the grand, majestic portrait one would expect to be immortalized in oil and hung in a gallery for future generations to admire. To be fair, the royal chamber pot was likely a masterpiece of its time, perhaps fine porcelain with gilded rims, attended to by servants who were expertly trained in the art of maintaining a stoic and unflinching expression. But no amount of luxury can erase the fundamental awkwardness of the situation. It's the kind of death that gets relegated to hushed whispers in historical footnotes, not celebrated in epic ballads. The royal physicians, with a great deal of tact, wrote up the official report with as much dignity as they could muster. The public was simply informed that the king had succumbed to a heart ailment, which was true in the strictest sense. However, the full, unvarnished story was preserved for posterity, thanks to the irresistible allure of court gossip and the candid accounts of a few palace attendants, who knew a good story when they saw one. And so, history has not let it go. For all of his military victories, his political reforms, and his long reign over a burgeoning global empire, King George II is most vividly remembered for one simple, inescapable fact: he is the only British monarch to have died on the toilet. It is a peculiar and unmatched legacy, a stark reminder that in the end, even a king who rules an empire is, after all, only human. Some royal deaths are tragic, others are simply strange, and then there is the death of Sigurd the Mighty, who achieved something so profoundly absurd it feels less like history and more like a dark, comedic fable. He managed to die from a bite delivered by a man who was already dead. It's a demise so outlandish that even the most imaginative storytellers would hesitate to write it, fearing it was too unbelievable to be taken seriously. Let's travel back to the windswept shores of 9th century Scotland. Sigurd Eysteinsson, known to his followers and victims as Sigurd the Mighty, was the Viking Earl of Orkney. He was a formidable warrior, a quintessential Norse leader who spent his life raiding, conquering, and carving out a kingdom for himself in the northern British Isles with fire and steel. He was the very picture of Viking strength and ferocity. During one of his campaigns, he challenged and defeated a rival Scottish chieftain named Brit, often called Brit the Buck-toothed for his prominent teeth, in a move that was equal parts Viking bravado and questionable battlefield hygiene. Sigurd had his foe's head severed and, as a gruesome trophy of his victory, tied it to his saddle. This was a common, if brutal, way to display one's triumph in the Viking world. As Sigurd and his men rode home victorious, the severed head, in a moment of cosmic irony, one of the dead man's prominent teeth grazed Sigurd's calf, creating a small, seemingly insignificant cut. For a warrior, accustomed to the wounds of battle, a minor scratch was nothing to worry about. However, this was the 9th century, an era with no understanding of bacteria, antibiotics, or infection control. The small wound festered quickly, becoming inflamed and swollen. Within days, the victorious Viking earl, who had survived countless battles and slain numerous enemies, was brought down not by a sword or an arrow, but by a simple scratch that had turned into a deadly infection. Imagine the scene as his life faded away. The great Sigurd, the mighty conqueror of lands and men, was defeated by a posthumous bite. It is not just ironic, it is a moment of historical slapstick. One can only wonder what his fellow Vikings thought as they watched their leader succumb to such an inglorious fate. Did they dare to laugh? Or did they just quietly untie the head from the saddle and ponder the strange whims of the gods? Sigurd's story has since become a legendary cautionary tale, a reminder that victory is never guaranteed and that danger can come from the most unexpected of places. He is remembered not just as a powerful earl, but as the only Viking in history who, in a way, lost a duel to his opponent's dental work long after the fight was over. It's a truly unique and deeply embarrassing end for a man known as the Mighty. There are royal deaths that inspire a grim chuckle, and then there are those that are so profoundly bleak they leave a lasting chill. Our next story falls firmly into the latter category. We journey to 18th century Korea, to the court of the Joseon dynasty, and to the tragic tale of Crown Prince Sito. He was a young man born into the highest privilege, groomed for immense power, and ultimately remembered as the prince who died inside a wooden box. Not as a metaphor, but quite literally, Crown Prince Sito was, by all historical accounts, a deeply troubled individual. From a young age, he exhibited signs of severe mental illness, which manifested in violent outbursts and dangerously erratic behavior. Court records describe a prince who was unpredictable and feared, known to execute palace servants on a whim and wander the royal grounds at night, muttering to himself. For the court, and especially for his family, he was a source of constant terror and instability. His father, King Yongzhou, was the opposite. He was a devout Confucian monarch, composed, disciplined, and intensely concerned with order and appearances. The king was faced with an impossible choice. Executing his own son and heir would be a political disaster and a profound spiritual scandal. Yet, allowing Sito to live posed an even greater risk to the stability of the throne and the safety of everyone in the palace. So, the king devised a solution that was as creative as it was cruel. He ordered that Prince Sito be stripped of his titles and forced into a large wooden chest, the kind normally used for storing rice. The lid was sealed, and the chest was left in the palace courtyard under the blistering sun of a Korean mid-July. There was no trial, no executioner's blade, just a slow, suffocating sentence carried out in a grain box. For 8 agonizing days, the prince remained sealed inside. There was no ventilation, no food, and no water. It was a torturously slow and unimaginably horrific end, made all the more terrible by the fact that it was decreed by his own father. It's a demise so grim that it makes even the most brutal alternatives, like exile or a swift beheading, seem like acts of mercy in comparison. The official court records, always mindful of posterity, cleaned up the story. They state that Crown Prince Sito passed away as a result of divine judgment, a poetic but dishonest way to mask the grim reality. The truth is that he was executed by furniture. Ironically, Sato's own son, Jungjo, would later ascend the throne and become one of Korea's most revered and effective rulers, forever haunted by the tragedy of his father. The royal family never spoke publicly of the rice chest incident, shrouding it in a veil of pained silence. But history never forgot. The story of Crown Prince Sito serves as a harrowing tale of unchecked mental illness, cold palace politics, and a father's desperate, cruel solution to an unsolvable problem. It is a chilling reminder of the dark secrets that can be sealed away behind palace walls. If you've ever been told that laughter is the best medicine, allow me to introduce you to the one man in history who provides a compelling argument to the contrary. We now turn to King Martin of Aragon, who, in a truly singular fashion, managed to quite literally overdose on humor. His story serves as a peculiar warning that even the most joyful of human expressions can have unexpected, and in this case, fatal consequences. The year was 1410, and King Martin was nearing the end of his reign. He was confined to his bed, not from a noble wound or a grave illness, but from a severe and persistent case of indigestion. No royal story, it seems, is complete without some form of gastrointestinal drama. That evening, feeling particularly bloated and uncomfortable, he made a simple request: summon the court jester for a joke. He needed something, anything, to lift his spirits. The jester, a man named Bora, duly appeared at the royal bedside. The king asked him where he had been, and the jester, after a dramatic pause, delivered his joke. As court accounts have preserved it, the jester replied that he had been in the vineyard, where he saw a young deer hanging from a tree by its tail, as if it were being punished for stealing figs. Now, perhaps it was the timing, the king's fragile state, or the sheer delirium from his digestive distress, but for whatever reason, the joke struck Martin as the most hilarious thing he had ever heard. He burst into a fit of hysterical laughter. It was not a gentle chuckle or a hearty guffaw, but a relentless, uncontrollable wave of hysterics that seized his entire body. He laughed and laughed, completely unable to stop. His attendants watched as the king, gasping for breath between peals of laughter, began to clutch his stomach in pain. The laughter continued until he finally collapsed, exhausted and breathless, upon his bed. He never recovered. The King of Aragon had expired. The official cause of death was recorded as a fatal combination of indigestion and uncontrollable laughter. Yes, King Martin of Aragon literally laughed himself to death. There is something both deeply tragic and profoundly undignified about it. Monarchs are supposed to meet their end heroically on a battlefield or peacefully in a marbled hall, not while giggling at a joke about a deer. The succession crisis that followed his highly unusual death plunged the kingdom into 2 years of political chaos, a period known as the interregnum. His advisors must have struggled to write the official reports with a straight face. In the end, King Martin's death became a bizarre legend, a historical footnote proving that, yes, humor can be deadly. It's a quiet reminder to laugh wisely, especially after a heavy meal. If ever there was a man in history who was utterly determined to cheat death, it was Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China. He was a ruler who didn't just dream of achieving immortality. He demanded it, commissioning grand projects and dispatching expeditions in a relentless quest to live forever. The irony, of course, is that the very thing he believed would make him eternal is precisely what killed him. Ruling in the 3rd century BCE, Qin Shi Huang was a figure of immense power and ambition. He standardized Chinese writing, currency, and measurements. He connected his empire with a vast network of roads and began construction of what would become the Great Wall. And most famously, he commissioned the legendary Terracotta Army, thousands of life-sized clay soldiers built to protect him in the afterlife, an afterlife he had no intention of ever visiting. The emperor was obsessed with the idea of living forever and tasked his most trusted court alchemists with a single, critical mission to discover or create an elixir of life. After much searching and mystical experimentation, they presented him with their solution, a substance they believed held the very essence of immortality. That substance was mercury. They crafted tiny, shimmering pills from the toxic liquid metal, marketing them as the ultimate key to eternal life. To the ancient alchemists, the mysterious, flowing nature of mercury seemed to hold a divine power. The emperor, convinced he was consuming a miracle, began taking these mercury-based treatments every single day, believing each pill was bringing him closer to his goal of becoming a god on earth. The result was predictable. Instead of becoming stronger, the emperor's health began to rapidly decline. He grew increasingly paranoid, his behavior became erratic, and his judgment faltered, all classic signs of severe mercury poisoning. Yet he continued to take the pills, his faith in his alchemists unshaken, even as his body failed him. During one of his secretive inspection tours across the empire, a journey he undertook to find more mystical ingredients for his elixir, he finally collapsed and died. He had been poisoned, slowly and methodically, by his own desperate quest for immortality. His attendants, fearing a succession crisis, panicked and decided to hide his death for weeks as they traveled back to the capital. To accomplish this grim deception, they needed a way to mask the unmistakable smell of the emperor's rapidly decomposing body. Their solution was as crude as it was effective. They arranged for a cart loaded with salted, rotting fish to travel alongside the emperor's carriage. It was a deeply undignified end for a man who feared death above all else. The history of the papacy is filled with its fair share of high drama, political intrigue, crusades, schisms, and moments of profound faith. But few popes in the long line of succession ever reached the level of sheer, unadulterated chaos achieved by Pope John XII. His story is less one of spiritual leadership and more one of heavenly scandal, culminating in a death that was as unorthodox as his life. Born with the name Octavianus, he ascended to the papacy in the year 955 AD at the astonishingly young age of 18, placing the spiritual guidance of millions into the hands of a teenager, particularly one with immense power and little supervision, was not an ideal scenario. The result, as history would record, was even less ideal. John XII quickly became known less for his sermons and more for his shocking lack of piety. His papal palace, the Lateran, was reportedly transformed from a seat of Christendom into something resembling a rowdy nobleman's gambling den. Chroniclers of the time accused him of a litany of sins. He gambled with church offerings, he drank to excess, and he engaged in behavior that was profoundly unbecoming of his holy office. He was even said to have toasted to the devil during Mass, blurring the line between sacred duty and outright blasphemy. It should come as no surprise, then, that his death was equally scandalous. According to the accounts of several contemporary historians, Pope John XII died from a stroke. But this was not a stroke suffered during a quiet moment of prayer or while poring over sacred texts. Let that image settle for a moment. The vicar of Christ, the shepherd of the faithful, meeting his end in the midst of an adulterous affair. It is a story so scandalous it almost defies belief, representing a complete dereliction of his sacred vows. It's a moral abyss that stands out even in an era known for its corruption. Now, to be fair, the Vatican never issued an official statement confirming this particular version of events, likely because the scribes of the day would have preferred not to die of sheer embarrassment while writing it. The account could very well have been a juicy smear campaign orchestrated by his many political enemies. But whether true or not, the rumor took on a life of its own, and has clung to his legacy for over 1,000 years. His reign lasted for just under a decade, but in that short time, he managed to redefine the very meaning of an unpapal papacy. And so, Pope John XII joins our list, not just for the shocking circumstances of his death, but for how spectacularly he seemed to ignore his job description. The duties of a monarch can be fraught with peril. There are wars to be fought, assassination plots to be thwarted, and the occasional poisoned goblet to be avoided. But King Alexander of Greece met his end in a manner that no royal bodyguard could have ever predicted. He was not felled by a rival or a rebel, but by a monkey. Yes, a common, everyday monkey. The year was 1920, and Greece was in a state of delicate political balance. Alexander was a young and relatively inexperienced king, placed on the throne as a placeholder, while his father was living in exile. He held the crown, but not the true power, making his reign a quiet chapter in a tumultuous period of Greek history. His death, however, would be anything but quiet. The incident occurred one afternoon as Alexander was taking a leisurely stroll through the grounds of the royal estate with his dog. Suddenly, a Barbary macaque, a type of monkey known for its cleverness and notoriously short temper, appeared. The animal belonged to a palace staff member, who apparently saw no issue with letting his pet primate roam freely near the king. Naturally, the king's dog and the monkey began to fight. Like any loyal pet owner would, Alexander stepped in to separate the two animals. It was at that moment that a second monkey appeared from the trees. Feeling threatened by the royal intervention, the two monkeys turned their aggression on Alexander, biting him repeatedly on his leg and torso before being driven away. At first, the wounds did not seem serious. They were cleaned and bandaged, and the incident was dismissed as a strange but minor mishap. In an era before the widespread use of antibiotics, however, even a small bite could be a death sentence. The infection progressed to gangrene and then to sepsis, a deadly blood poisoning. Within just 3 weeks of the attack, the king of Greece was dead. The political fallout was immediate and immense. His unexpected death triggered a constitutional crisis, led to the return of his exiled father, and helped push the nation further into a spiral of instability. In a bizarre twist of fate, a monkey attack had become a major geopolitical event. The press at the time struggled with how to report such an undignified end. Killed by a monkey lacked the solemnity required for a royal obituary. Official statements used vague language, referring to an unfortunate injury or a sudden illness. When you picture the death of a medieval king, you might imagine a scene of high drama, a sword fight in a throne room, a vial of subtle poison, or at the very least, a dramatic fainting spell during a scandalous banquet. But King Charles II of Navarre, a man whose life was anything but ordinary, met an end that was both uniquely absurd and terrifyingly flammable. Let's set the stage. It is the late 14th century, and Charles II, who carried the ominous nickname Charles the Bad, was not in good health. After a long life filled with political scheming, constant betrayal, and general unpleasantness, he was old, frail, and suffering from a degenerative illness that left him weak and bedridden. His physicians, armed with the best medical knowledge of the era, which is to say, very little, prescribed a radical new treatment. The plan was this: they would wrap the king from head to toe in linen sheets that had been thoroughly soaked in brandy. Yes, you heard that correctly. Brandy-soaked bandages. The theory, as far as one can be pieced together, was that the alcohol-infused wrapping would warm his ailing body, draw out the sickness, and perhaps even pickle him back to a state of health. It was a desperate, bizarre, and ultimately catastrophic idea. To complete the treatment, a servant was tasked with sewing the king into this alcoholic cocoon, ensuring he was tightly swaddled. The final step was to snip the excess thread. The servant, working late into the night in a room lit only by the flickering glow of a single candle, leaned in close to make the final cut on the thread near the king's neck. And then the unthinkable happened. As the servant leaned in, the open flame of the candle touched the edge of the brandy-soaked linen. In an instant, the king was engulfed in flames. Being marinated in highly flammable spirits, he went up like a human torch. The servant shrieked in horror, and the palace was thrown into chaos as attendants rushed in to try and extinguish the living inferno. By the time they managed to put out the fire, it was far too late. King Charles the Bad had died in one of the most horrific and undignified ways in royal history, accidentally incinerated by his own medical treatment. The irony was almost too thick to bear. A man who had spent his entire reign metaphorically playing with fire, orchestrating plots and betraying allies, was ultimately undone by a literal flame. His end was a grimly fitting conclusion for a monarch known for his cruelty. A lifetime of treachery, poisoning rivals, and sowing chaos ended not with a bang, but with a spark. And so, Charles the Bad, who had once ruled with fire and fear, met his end as accidental firewood. It serves as a strange, historical lesson. Never mix medieval medicine with an open flame. Some royal deaths are marked by battlefield glory, and others by quiet, symbolic moments. And then there is the alleged end of King Edmund II of England. A death so undignified and startling that it has been whispered about for 1,000 years, according to a persistent and suspiciously detailed medieval rumor. The king, known as Ironside, met his end in the most vulnerable position imaginable, sitting on the toilet. Known as Edmund Ironside for his legendary grit and refusal to yield to Danish invaders, he reigned for a mere 7 months in the tumultuous year of 1016. His nickname was a testament to his valor on the battlefield. By the formidable king, Canute the Great, Edmund fought like a lion. Edmund fought like a lion, a true Anglo-Saxon warrior king, which makes the story of his death all the more jarring. The official historical record is frustratingly vague. Some sources claim he died of wounds sustained in battle, while others mention a sudden illness or an unspecified act of treachery. But a few medieval chroniclers, blessed with either secret knowledge or a flair for dramatic storytelling, offer a much more specific and grotesque account. They claim Edmund was assassinated while answering the call of nature. According to this version of events, a cunning assassin, knowing the king's daily routine, devised a truly heinous plan. The killer allegedly hid beneath the wooden seat of the royal privy, lying in wait in the darkness of the cesspit below. It is a grim and deeply unpleasant image, a betrayal lurking in the most private of spaces. When the unsuspecting king sat down, the assassin seized the opportunity, striking upwards with a long dagger from below. It was an attack that was as cowardly as it was clever, ensuring the king was completely unarmed, unarmored, and unprepared. The sheer audacity of the method is what has made the story so enduring. It's not just an assassination, it's the ultimate violation of a person's dignity. It's entirely possible that this story was a piece of political slander, a rumor invented by his enemies to tarnish the legacy of a powerful warrior, and yet it stuck. Nothing erodes a heroic reputation quite like the tale of an outhouse ambush. Imagine being remembered throughout history by the formidable name of Ironside, only for your death to be associated with such an inglorious and squalid end. Whether it is a hidden truth or a masterful piece of folklore, the tale of King Edmund II's death serves as a stark reminder that even the mightiest of kings are vulnerable. It suggests that for all their armor and their armies, a monarch is never more defenseless than when, in a moment of quiet, personal repose, even an iron-sided king has his soft spots. Of all the fatal indulgences that have claimed the lives of monarchs throughout history, from excessive feasts to dangerous liaisons, King Henry I of England may hold the prize for the most peculiar. In the year 1135, this powerful king, who had ruled for over 3 decades, surviving wars, rebellions, and endless political turmoil, was finally brought down by a plate of fish. Not just any fish, but a surfeit of lamprey. For those not familiar with this medieval delicacy, lampreys are jawless, eel-like creatures with a circular, suction cup mouth filled with rows of horned teeth. They are, to put it mildly, the stuff of aquatic nightmares. Today, most of us would likely call them horrifying sea worms, but in 12th century Europe, they were considered a rare and exquisite treat fit for a king. And King Henry I absolutely adored them. He wasn't just fond of lampreys. By all accounts, he was completely obsessed. His love for this strange, slimy dish was well known throughout the court, and it was a craving he indulged as often as he could, much to the dismay of his handlers and medical advisors. His court physicians, who operated with a medieval understanding of medicine that was mostly guesswork, had repeatedly warned the king against eating so many of them. Lampreys were known to be exceptionally rich and heavy, a dish that was notoriously difficult on the digestion. But Henry was a king, and what is the point of wearing a crown if you cannot ignore every piece of sound medical advice you are given? During a trip to Normandy, the king sat down for a grand meal and, against his doctor's orders, decided to gorge himself on his favorite food. He consumed what was described as a surfeit of lampreys, meaning he ate far, far too many of the slippery creatures. They were likely served boiled or stewed in a rich sauce, a grim pile of what looked like something from the bottom of the sea. Shortly after his indulgent meal, the king fell violently ill. He was seized with a sudden fever and excruciating abdominal pains, a full-scale royal digestive meltdown. His condition worsened rapidly, and within a few days, the mighty King of England was dead. The official cause was recorded as food poisoning, brought on by his unshakable love for a grotesque fish dinner. His body was embalmed for the long journey back to England, a process that, according to chroniclers, was not entirely successful and made the trip a rather unpleasant affair for his entourage. In the end, despite being a capable and often ruthless ruler, his legacy is forever entwined with his fatal final meal. It is said his doctors begged him to avoid the dish. His response was defiant. It seems he got his wish. Throughout history, many kings have died in the heat of battle, struck down by an enemy's sword or a well-aimed arrow. Others have succumbed to illness far from the front lines. But King James II of Scotland met his end in a way that combines the chaos of war with a tragic, self-inflicted irony. He died because he was standing too close to his own cannon. It was the year 1460, and James, at just 29 years old, was an ambitious and fiery ruler. He was known for two things: a famously short temper and a deep, almost boyish fascination with modern artillery. This was the dawn of cannon warfare, a time when these massive gunpowder weapons were as unpredictable and dangerous to their operators as they were to the enemy. At the time, James was leading a siege against Roxburgh Castle, a key stronghold still held by the English, eager to demonstrate the power of his shiny new cannons, which he had imported from Flanders at great expense. James ordered a ceremonial firing, and naturally, wanting the best possible view of the action, he chose to stand just a few feet away from one of the largest cannons in his arsenal. One can almost picture the scene: the king, filled with pride and anticipation, watching as his men loaded the massive cast-iron tube with gunpowder and a heavy stone ball. He was there to witness the awesome power he had brought to Scotland. What could possibly go wrong when standing next to a piece of notoriously unreliable 15th-century explosive technology? As it turns out, everything. As the cannon was lit, it did not fire correctly. Instead, the barrel, flawed in its casting, exploded. In a deafening roar of fire and smoke, the massive weapon disintegrated, sending jagged shards of superheated metal flying in every direction. The blast was so powerful and so sudden that the king's attendants were thrown to the ground in shock and confusion. A large piece of the exploding cannon barrel struck James in the thigh, severing his leg and killing him almost instantly. The king, who so loved his artillery, was undone by it in a single, violent moment. The Scottish army was thrown into temporary chaos, their monarch having just been spectacularly and publicly detonated before their very eyes. To their credit, however, the Scots eventually regrouped, rallied by the king's widow, and went on to capture the castle. In a grimly ironic tribute, they later renamed it in his honor. James had been a huge proponent of modernizing Scotland's military, but his passion for firepower tragically outpaced his appreciation for a safe viewing distance. He is remembered today not just as a king, but as one of the few monarchs in history to be blown up by his own enthusiasm. If the Roman Empire ever needed a poster child for the concept of too much, too soon, it would undoubtedly be the Emperor Elagabalus. Born Varius Avitus Bassianus, he ascended to the imperial throne in 218 AD at the tender age of 14. When you combine the impulsiveness of a teenager with the near-limitless power of a Roman emperor, you get one of the most bizarre, chaotic, and ultimately short-lived reigns in all of history. Elagabalus didn't just bend the rules of Roman society. He melted them down and reforged them into something utterly unrecognizable. His behavior was a constant source of shock and scandal to the conservative Roman elite. He appointed his favorite courtiers to high office based on trivial attributes, and once famously held a banquet where he released so many rose petals from the ceiling that some of his guests reportedly suffocated. His personal life was even more unconventional. He married 5 times in his short 4-year reign, including once to a Vestal virgin, which was a deeply sacrilegious act in Roman law. He was famous for dressing in fine silks, wearing elaborate makeup, and reportedly asking to be addressed as empress rather than emperor. In an empire built on rigid ideals of Roman masculinity, his actions were seen as a profound betrayal of tradition. In modern terms, we might describe his behavior as gender non-conforming or fluid, but to the powerful figures of ancient Rome, it was simply unacceptable. He reportedly offered vast sums of money to any physician who could perform a surgical gender transition, a concept so far beyond the pale for his time that it only cemented his reputation as a dangerous eccentric who threatened the very fabric of their society. While his social scandals were enough to make the Senate deeply uneasy, what truly sealed his fate was his religious policy. Elagabalus was a priest of a Syrian sun god, also named Elagobal, and he tried to replace Jupiter, the supreme god of the Roman pantheon, with his own deity. He built a lavish temple and forced senators to participate in rituals they considered foreign and blasphemous, including dancing around a sacred black stone he had brought from Syria. Eventually, the Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers sworn to protect the emperor, had seen enough. The religious sacrilege, the social scandals, and the general chaos were too much to bear. In 222 AD, they turned on the young emperor and his mother, assassinating them both within the palace walls. Elagabalus was only 18 years old. His end was as undignified as his reign was chaotic. Their bodies were not given a royal burial, but were reportedly dragged through the streets of Rome before being unceremoniously dumped into the Tiber River. The Roman Empire then collectively hit the reset button, trying to erase the memory of the strange teenage emperor. His reign was too weird, too wild, and for Rome, simply too much. Few rulers in history have cultivated a reputation as grand or as scandalously misunderstood as Catherine the Great of Russia. She was a brilliant political strategist, a patron of the arts and sciences who corresponded with Voltaire, and a formidable empress who dramatically expanded the borders of the Russian Empire. But if you mention her name today, there is a good chance someone will bring up a horse. Let us address this immediately and with absolute clarity. No, Catherine the Great did not die during an intimate encounter with a stallion. This myth, which has proven to be absurdly persistent, is a complete and utter fabrication. It has no historical basis whatsoever and was invented by her enemies after her death. The story says far more about the nature of 18th century political slander than it does about Catherine herself. The real story of her death is far more mundane. In November of 1796, at the age of 67, the Empress of Russia suffered a severe stroke. She was found collapsed on the floor of her private dressing room, and, despite her attendants' best efforts, she never regained consciousness. She passed away quietly the following day. Her end was undramatic, peaceful, and entirely human. So why did the bizarre and vulgar horse rumor emerge? During her long reign, Catherine made powerful enemies, both within Russia and abroad. She was a woman ruling a vast empire alone, in a world utterly dominated by men. She was unapologetically intelligent, politically ruthless, and known for having a passionate personal life. She had several lovers, which was certainly no different from the male monarchs of her time. The difference, of course, was the double standard. While kings were often praised for their romantic conquests, Catherine's relationships were used to paint her as decadent and morally corrupt. After her death, her political rivals and bitter aristocrats, particularly her estranged son Paul, seized the opportunity to undermine her legacy. The horse rumor was a weapon, a piece of slander, so shocking and humiliating it was designed to stain her name forever. And it worked, not because it was believable, but because it was too outrageous to forget. It became the royal equivalent of a vicious tabloid headline that simply refuses to go away. It's a profound injustice that a ruler of her stature, a woman who dragged the Russian Empire into the Enlightenment and cemented its place as a global power, is still haunted by a baseless, equestrian footnote. In the end, Catherine the Great did not die in a moment of high drama or shocking scandal. She died quietly, privately, and with a dignity that history, unfortunately, has not always afforded her memory. If there is a lesson in her story, it's that a ruler's power may be fleeting, but a malicious rumor, once unleashed, can gallop through centuries. While many great rulers are brought down by the sword of an enemy or the slow creep of disease, some are defeated by something far more intimate, their own character flaws. Such was the case with the Roman Emperor Valentinian I, a man of immense power and military prowess, who was ultimately vanquished not by a barbarian army, but by his own uncontrollable, explosive rage. Ruling in the late 4th century AD, Valentinian was a quintessential soldier emperor. He was a brilliant general, a competent administrator, and a fierce defender of the Roman frontier. But he was most famous among his contemporaries for his terrifying temper. Court records describe a man prone to violent outbursts of fury over the smallest of matters, a leader whose anger was as feared as any enemy legion. The final, fatal eruption of this temper occurred in the year 375 AD. Valentinian was at a military camp on the Danube frontier, meeting with a delegation of envoys from a Germanic tribe known as the Quadi. The tribe had been raiding Roman territory, and this meeting was intended to be a diplomatic negotiation to secure peace. The Quadi, however, did not arrive in a spirit of humble apology. Instead of being submissive, the Quadi envoys were insolent and demanding. They argued that the Romans were to blame for the conflict, complained about the forts being built on their land, and generally behaved not as defeated supplicants, but as equals. They showed little of the fear and deference that Valentinian expected and demanded from those he considered barbarians. As the emperor listened to their excuses and their arrogant posturing, his legendary temper began to build. According to the historian Ammianus Marcellinus, who documented the event, Valentinian's face turned a deep shade of purple as he struggled to contain his fury. When the envoys finally finished speaking, he exploded into a volcanic tirade. He began shouting at the top of his lungs, berating the envoys for their insolence and threatening to raise an army so vast it would completely annihilate their people. He screamed with such incredible force and passion that in the very midst of his furious speech, he suddenly gasped, choked, and collapsed. He had suffered a massive stroke, bursting a blood vessel in his brain from the sheer physical strain of his own anger. His guards and attendants rushed to his side, but it was too late. The most powerful man in the Western Roman Empire lay dying on the floor, silenced not by an assassin's blade, but by his own temper tantrum. Valentinian was a ruler who had successfully defended his empire from countless external threats. But in the end, he could not defend himself from the enemy within. Few names in history inspire as much fear and dread as Attila the Hun. He was known to the Romans as the Scourge of God, a relentless warrior king who carved out a vast empire through sheer force of will. His hordes of nomadic horsemen terrorized Europe, sacking cities and bringing both the Eastern and Western Roman empires to their knees. He was the embodiment of conquest, a figure synonymous with fire, steel, and destruction. One would expect such a man to die in a cataclysmic battle, a final, earth-shaking clash of civilizations. But that is not what happened. The end for the most feared man of the 5th century came not on a battlefield, but in his own bed, on his wedding night. In the year 453 AD, Attila, though already having many wives, decided to take another, a young woman named Ildiko. A great feast was held in his honor, a night of celebration filled with excessive eating and, most notably, a great deal of drinking. After a long night of revelry, the mighty king, heavily intoxicated, finally retired to his wedding tent with his new bride. His warriors and attendants, still celebrating outside, likely expected their leader to emerge the next morning, triumphant as always. The camp was filled with the sounds of music and drunken cheers, a fitting celebration for the king of the Huns. The next morning, however, a deep and unnerving silence emanated from the royal tent. Hours passed, and still Attila did not appear. His guards, at first hesitant to disturb him, grew increasingly concerned. Fearing that something was terribly wrong, they finally forced their way into the chamber, their hearts pounding with a sense of dread. Inside, they discovered a scene of quiet, bewildering tragedy. Attila lay dead on his bed, with no visible wounds and no sign of a struggle. His new wife, Ildiko, was huddled in a corner, weeping in terror. There had been no assassin, no poison, no last stand. The great conqueror was simply gone, having passed away silently in the night. Upon closer examination, the bizarre cause of his death was revealed. Attila had suffered a severe nosebleed in his drunken, unconscious state, lying flat on his back. He had been unable to clear his throat and had tragically choked on his own blood. The Scourge of God, a man whose armies had drained the blood of thousands, had been brought down by a simple, mundane hemorrhage. The irony of his end is profound. The man who lived and breathed violence, who had survived countless battles and assassination plots, died not in a blaze of glory, but in a quiet, pathetic accident. His enemies, who had spent years dreaming of his demise, could never have imagined such a peaceful and deeply undignified exit. His death threw his empire into immediate chaos, and without his leadership, it crumbled almost as quickly as it had been built. William the Conqueror, the formidable Duke of Normandy, who seized the English throne in 1066, was a man whose life was defined by power, control, and brutal efficiency. He was the victor of the Battle of Hastings, the architect of the Doomsday Book, and a king who ruled with an iron fist. One would assume that such a monumental figure would have an end, if not peaceful, then at least dignified. History, however, had other plans. In the summer of 1087, an aging and corpulent William was leading a military campaign in France. While sacking the town of Mantes, he rode through the smoldering ruins, surveying the destruction his army had wrought. It was in this moment of victory that his downfall came, not from an enemy soldier, but from his own horse. Startled by a hot ember on the ground, his steed reared up violently. The king, heavy and caught off guard, was thrown forward with great force against the high, hard pommel of his saddle. The impact caused a severe internal injury, rupturing his intestines. The great conqueror, who had faced down entire armies, was felled by a clumsy, painful, and deeply unheroic accident. He was carried from the scene of the battle and taken to a monastery in Rouen, where he lingered in agonizing pain for several weeks. As infection set in, the man who had reshaped the destiny of England slowly faded. When he finally died, the indignities that would plague his memory began almost immediately. Upon his death, his noble attendants, and even his own sons, abandoned his body and fled, eager to secure their own lands and fortunes in the ensuing power vacuum. For a time, the corpse of the mighty King William lay alone in an empty room, stripped of its royal finery by opportunistic servants. Eventually, a lowly knight arranged for the body to be transported to Cannes for burial. But a new and gruesome problem awaited. In the weeks since his death, the king's body, aided by the heat and the nature of his internal injury, had bloated to a considerable size. When the funeral ceremony began at the abbey he himself had built, it became horrifyingly clear that the stone sarcophagus carved for him was now far too small. The bishops and monks, determined to proceed, made a grim decision. They attempted to forcibly squeeze the swollen corpse into the narrow tomb. The pressure became too much. In front of the assembled nobility and clergy, the king's abdomen burst. A foul, putrid stench filled the church, sending horrified mourners reeling and covering their faces. The rest of the ceremony was rushed to a conclusion as priests and nobles alike fled the overwhelming odor. The great William the Conqueror had exploded at his own funeral. His end was a chaotic and embarrassing spectacle, a stark contrast to a life built on absolute control. The agents of death, especially for the powerful, are often imagined to be grand and fearsome. A skillfully wielded blade, a subtle poison, or a devastating illness. History, however, sometimes chooses a far more humble instrument for its final act. In the case of Pope Adrian IV, legend tells us that the mighty leader of the Catholic Church was brought down not by a political conspiracy, but by an antagonist almost too small to see, a common fly. Pope Adrian IV, who reigned from 1154 to 1159, holds a unique place in history as the one and only Englishman ever to have sat on the papal throne. He was a man of considerable influence during a tumultuous period, a powerful figure who contended with emperors and kings, and whose decrees could shape the course of European history. His end, however, is remembered for its sheer, improbable absurdity. The story, which has been passed down through the centuries, is simple and swift. One warm afternoon, the Pope was taking a moment of repose, about to quench his thirst with a goblet of wine. The scene would have been one of perfect tranquility, a quiet room in a papal palace, the sun streaming through a window, a moment of peace for one of the world's busiest men. As he raised the cup to his lips and took a drink, a single, errant fly that had been buzzing in the room allegedly flew directly into the goblet and was immediately swallowed. The insect, a minuscule speck of life, became lodged in the Pope's throat, cutting off his ability to breathe. In an instant, the peaceful scene turned to one of panic. The Pope began to choke violently, gasping for air. His attendants, horrified and helpless, rushed to his side, but there was nothing they could do. The leader of Western Christendom, a man whose words could launch crusades, was silenced in a matter of moments by the tiniest of assailants. Now, it is important to note that many historians view this story as more of a folk tale than a fact. The more probable, and medically sound, explanation for his death is that he was suffering from an illness called quinsy, a severe and painful abscess in the throat that would have caused massive swelling and made it difficult, and eventually impossible, to breathe. The sensation would have been very much like choking. But the fly story, whether true or not, is the one that has endured. It persisted because the irony is simply too powerful to ignore. The image of the Supreme Pontiff, a man considered God's own representative on earth, being defeated by a creature so insignificant, is a potent, if grim, lesson in humility. It's a story that speaks to the fragility of life and the random, unpredictable nature of fate. And so, whether his end came from a bacterial infection or a badly timed insect, Pope Adrian IV's final moments were a struggle for breath. The legend, however, has forever colored his legacy, leaving him remembered in the more curious footnotes of history as the one and only pope to have lost a duel with a fly. The Roman Emperor Claudius was, by all accounts, an emperor who should never have been. Plagued by a limp, a stammer, and other physical infirmities, he was long regarded as a fool by the imperial family and was kept hidden from public life. Yet, when he was thrust into power after the assassination of his nephew Caligula, he proved to be a surprisingly intelligent and capable ruler. His end, however, was a grim reminder that in the deadly game of Roman politics, intelligence is no defense against betrayal from within your own home. The architect of his demise was his fourth and final wife, Agrippina the Younger. She was ambitious, politically ruthless, and the mother of a son from a previous marriage. The young Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, who the world would later come to know as Nero, Agrippina's single-minded goal was to see her son on the throne, even if it meant bypassing Claudius's own biological son, Britannicus. By the year 54 AD, Agrippina sensed that her time to act was running short. Claudius was growing older, but had begun to show renewed favor towards Britannicus, his rightful heir. Fearing that Nero's path to power would be blocked, Agrippina decided that her husband, the emperor, had to be removed from the picture permanently. She chose a classic Roman method for her coup: poison. The poison was to be delivered in a manner that would arouse no suspicion, hidden within a dish of one of the emperor's favorite foods, a simple plate of mushrooms. It was the ultimate domestic betrayal, a fatal meal served with a smile by a loving wife. The scene was set for a quiet, unassuming assassination at the imperial dinner table. According to the account of the historian Tacitus, the first dose of poison, mixed into the savory mushrooms, was not potent enough. It made Claudius violently ill, and he writhed in agony, but the poison failed to kill him. For a terrifying moment, it seemed Agrippina's carefully laid plan had failed, and that the emperor, having survived, would surely exact his revenge. Panicking but ever resourceful, Agrippina had a backup plan already in motion. The emperor's own doctor, a Greek physician named Xenophon, was secretly in her employ. He was summoned to the emperor's side to help the supposedly sick man, pretending to induce vomiting to clear the emperor's stomach. A common medical practice, the doctor inserted a feather into Claudius's throat. This feather, however, had been dipped in a second, far more potent and fast-acting poison. This final, intimate act of betrayal worked instantly. The emperor died shortly thereafter. He was murdered, not only by his wife, but by the very man sworn to heal him, in a moment of supreme vulnerability. Claudius, the unlikely scholar, who had survived the murderous reign of Caligula, was ultimately undone by his trust in his wife and his fondness for mushrooms. His death paved the way for the infamous reign of Nero, making his quiet, domestic murder a pivotal and tragic moment in history. Baldwin I of Jerusalem was one of the towering figures of the First Crusade. He was a formidable knight, a cunning strategist, and the first man to be crowned king of the Crusader state of Jerusalem. He spent his life fighting for control of the Holy Land, a hardened warrior who seemed invincible in a world of constant, brutal conflict. His end, however, came not from a Saracen blade, but from a simple meal eaten in the wrong place. In the spring of 1118, the ever-ambitious Baldwin was leading a military expedition deep into the heart of Egypt, striking at the powerful Fatimid Caliphate. It was a bold and dangerous campaign, but Baldwin's army succeeded in pushing all the way to the Nile Delta. As he stood on the banks of the great river of the Pharaohs, it must have felt like a moment of ultimate triumph for the Crusader king. While camped near the river, Baldwin and his men decided to supplement their rations by catching some of the local fish. Despite the Nile being a river steeped in a history that many Christians of the era would have considered pagan and unclean, the king, perhaps feeling overconfident in his victory, decided to partake in the feast. A large fish was caught and prepared for the royal dinner. Shortly after eating the fish, King Baldwin fell violently ill. He was struck with severe stomach pains and sickness, the unmistakable signs of a powerful food poisoning. The mighty warrior who had survived countless battles, sieges, and assassination attempts was rendered completely helpless by a pathogen lurking within the flesh of a fish from the great river of Egypt. Realizing that his condition was grave and likely fatal, the dying king gave his final order. The army was to turn back immediately and carry him home to Jerusalem. The triumphant invasion of Egypt was abandoned. The image is a deeply ironic one, a great conqueror at the height of his power, being carried away on a litter, defeated not by an army, but by his own dinner. Baldwin succumbed to his illness during the long, slow retreat through the Sinai desert, dying before he could reach his beloved kingdom. His attendants were now faced with a grim and difficult task: how to transport the king's body across the hot desert for a proper royal burial in Jerusalem without it decomposing. Following what were said to be the king's own deathbed instructions, they resorted to a macabre but practical solution. The king's cook was ordered to gut the body and then boil the flesh from his bones. The clean skeleton was then packed for the remainder of the journey, while his organs and flesh were buried on the spot. It was a strange, gruesome process that ensured the king's bones, at least, could be laid to rest in the hallowed ground of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It was a deeply undignified end for a pious king. The lives of young monarchs are often imagined as grand tapestries, woven with threads of power, political marriages, and dynastic ambitions. But for all their supposed glory, these lives can be shockingly fragile, capable of being unraveled by the most mundane of physical frailties. Such was the case for Francis II of France, a young king whose promising reign was cut short not by an assassin's dagger or a rival army, but by a simple infection in his ear. Francis ascended to the French throne in 1559 as a frail and awkward teenager. He was also famously the first husband of Mary, Queen of Scots, a marriage that united the crowns of France and Scotland and placed him at the very center of European power politics. This union held the potential to create a formidable Catholic superstate, a prospect that terrified Protestant England and its queen, Elizabeth I. From birth, however, Francis had been a sickly child. He lacked the robust health and commanding presence of his father, King Henry II, and his delicate constitution was a constant source of anxiety for the French court. His powerful mother, Catherine de' Medici, watched over him carefully, knowing that the future of her family's dynasty rested on the shoulders of her fragile son. In the winter of 1560, the king, still only 16 years old, fell ill. What began as a seemingly minor ailment, a pain in his ear, quickly grew more serious. In an age before antibiotics, any common infection could become a life-or-death struggle, even for a king. The best physicians in the kingdom were summoned to the royal bedside, but their medieval remedies were useless. The infection in the king's ear worsened, developing into a painful abscess. He was racked with fever, delirium, and agonizing headaches as the infection began to spread. The doctors, relying on the ineffective treatments of the day, like bleeding and herbal poultices, could do nothing to halt its progress. The court could only watch and pray as their young king's health rapidly deteriorated. Ultimately, the infection reached his brain, leading to a fatal seizure or meningitis. Surrounded by his desperate physicians and his grieving family, the King of France and Consort of Scotland died. The ruler of a vast and powerful kingdom, a key player in the great game of European politics, was defeated by a localized infection that today would likely be cured with a simple course of antibiotics. The political consequences of his mundane death were immense. It immediately shattered the powerful alliance between France and Scotland. His young widow, Mary, was forced to return to her native Scotland, a move that set in motion the tragic chain of events that would eventually lead to her own downfall. His death also created a power vacuum in France, allowing his mother to seize control as regent and contributing to the tensions that would soon erupt into the brutal French wars of religion. The fate of nations had been altered by a simple earache. The Byzantine Emperor Basil I was a man whose life story reads like a legend. He rose from the humble origins of a peasant to become the founder of the powerful Macedonian dynasty, which would rule the Eastern Roman Empire for nearly 2 centuries. He was a man of legendary physical strength, ruthless ambition, and political cunning, who seized the throne through violence and held it with an iron grip. His end was just as dramatic and strange as his rise to power. Like many rulers of his time, Basil was an avid hunter. The royal hunt was more than a mere sport. It was a performance of martial skill, a display of courage and dominance over the natural world. Basil was known to be a master of the hunt, fearlessly pursuing wild boars and deer through the dense forests that surrounded the imperial capital of Constantinople. It was this passion that would lead to his bizarre and violent demise. In the summer of the year 886, the emperor was leading a hunting expedition. The chase was on for a particularly large and magnificent stag. As the hunt grew more intense, Basil, ever the bold pursuer, galloped ahead of his retinue, becoming separated from his guards and attendants as he closed in on his quarry through the thick woods. As the emperor confronted the stag, a chaotic struggle ensued. In the confusion, the ornate belt that Basil wore, a symbol of his imperial status, somehow became entangled in the stag's massive, powerful antlers. In an instant, the hunter had become the hunted, his body battered by rocks and branches. It was a terrifying and profoundly undignified ordeal. Eventually, one of Basil's attendants managed to catch up to the rampaging animal. In a desperate move to save his master, the attendant drew his sword and sliced through the emperor's belt, cutting him free, but the damage had been done. Basil had suffered severe internal injuries during the violent episode. He was carefully carried back to the palace in Constantinople, but a fever soon set in, and his condition rapidly worsened. A few days later, the peasant who had become an emperor was dead. While some historians whisper that the story may have been an elaborate cover for an assassination plot, the official and most enduring account is that he was killed by a stag. It was a strange, almost mythical end for a man larger than life, a reminder that even an emperor cannot always tame the forces of the wild. But history often has a wicked sense of humor, and sometimes a monarch's story concludes not with a roar, but with a quiet, clumsy thud. Such was the profoundly anticlimactic end of King Charles VIII of France. Charles, who ruled in the late 15th century, was a man of immense ambition. He is best known for launching the first of the Italian Wars, leading a massive French army across the Alps in a grand and ultimately fruitless quest to conquer the Kingdom of Naples. He was a ruler who dreamed of glory, of recreating the legendary exploits of Charlemagne and the ancient Caesars. His end, however, involved no such grandeur. By all contemporary accounts, Charles was a man of rather short stature. This detail, which might otherwise be a simple historical footnote, becomes cruelly ironic in the context of his death. It serves as a small but important part of the story of how a king, inside his own palace, could meet such a strange and unexpected fate. The fatal day was April 7th, 1498, at his beloved royal residence, the Château d'Amboise. The king and his queen were on their way to watch a game of jeu de paume, an early form of tennis, which was being played in the castle's moat. It was a day of leisure, a simple domestic scene, far removed from the battlefields of Italy or the intrigue of the royal court. As he was making his way to the viewing area, Charles had to pass through a dimly lit stone gallery. In a moment of distraction, and despite his lack of height, he struck his head violently on the hard stone lintel of a low doorway. It was a simple, everyday kind of accident, the sort of clumsy mistake anyone might make when not paying attention to their surroundings. According to the chronicler, Philippe de Comines, who was an eyewitness, the king stumbled from the blow, but initially brushed it off. He seemed unhurt and continued on his way, joining his companions to watch the tennis match below. He even engaged in conversation for some time, and it appeared for a moment that the incident was nothing more than a minor, embarrassing bump on the head. After watching the game for a while, however, the king suddenly collapsed. He was carried to a simple pallet bed in a nearby chamber, a room described as being rather squalid and undignified, where he quickly fell into a coma. Just a few hours later, King Charles VIII of France was dead, the victim of what modern doctors would likely diagnose as a subdural hematoma, a brain injury resulting from his collision with the doorframe. The king who had led an army across the Alps, who dreamed of conquering foreign lands and forging a new empire, died because he failed to watch where he was going. His end was a quiet, domestic, and deeply embarrassing accident, a final, anticlimactic chapter to a life of grandiose ambition. To live a long life in the volatile world of 18th century European royalty was an achievement in itself. To survive decades of war, exile, and political upheaval seems almost miraculous. Such was the life of Stanisław Leszewski, a man who was twice King of Poland and the father-in-law of a French king. After a lifetime of navigating political firestorms, his end came not from a rival's plot, but from a literal fire in the peace and quiet of his own room. Stanisław's career was a dizzying roller coaster of fortune. He was first elected King of Poland in 1704, only to be deposed a few years later. He spent years in exile before being elected to the throne once more in 1733, a move which triggered the War of the Polish Succession. He lost the throne a second time, becoming a royal pawn in the great chess match between the major powers of Europe. His was a life defined by instability. Eventually, however, fate dealt him a peaceful final hand. Through a political settlement, he was made the Duke of Lorraine and Bar, a wealthy duchy in France. Here, he finally settled into a comfortable and serene existence. He became a celebrated patron of the arts and sciences, ruling his small domain with wisdom and charm. It seemed the man who had weathered so many storms had finally found a safe and quiet harbor in his old age. The fatal incident occurred in February of 1766. Stanisław, now an elderly man of 88, was dozing in a comfortable armchair drawn up close to the fireplace in his chambers. It was a simple, domestic scene of an old man taking a nap, a fire burning gently in the hearth to keep the winter cold at bay. As he slept, a stray ember is believed to have leaped from the fireplace and landed on the fine silk of his dressing gown. Unnoticed, the fabric began to smolder, and then, in an instant, it caught fire. The former king awoke from his slumber to the horror of finding himself engulfed in flames. His peaceful nap turned into a waking nightmare. Alerted by his desperate cries for help, his attendants rushed into the room. They managed to extinguish the fire, but the damage was catastrophic. The elderly duke had suffered severe and extensive burns across his body. In an era with no modern treatments for such injuries, his chances of survival were slim. Despite the frantic efforts of his physicians, the burns were simply too grievous for a man of his advanced age to overcome. He lingered in terrible pain for more than 2 weeks before finally passing away. The man who had survived the political fires of half a century was ultimately consumed by a literal one. His long and dramatic life ended in a random, tragic, and deeply unfortunate household accident, a quiet and painful footnote to a storied career. The throne is the ultimate symbol of a monarch's power. It is the seat of authority, a physical manifestation of their right to rule, often crafted from the finest wood, stone, and gold. But what happens when that very symbol of majesty becomes the instrument of a king's demise? This is the strange and deeply ironic story of King I of Hungary, a monarch who was, quite literally, killed by his own throne. The first, who ruled in the 11th century, was a man known for his strength and resolve. He earned the nickname the Champion for his military prowess and his efforts to stabilize the Hungarian kingdom. After seizing power from his brother, he worked tirelessly to suppress pagan uprisings and strengthen the Christian foundations of his realm. He was a powerful figure, a king who had fought and bled for his crown. The fatal incident occurred in the year 1063 at his royal manor in DMDs. The king was holding court, seated upon his throne and attending to the affairs of state. This was not just a simple chair, but likely a large, imposing wooden structure, perhaps built upon a raised platform with an ornate, heavy canopy overhead, a piece of furniture designed to inspire awe and respect in all who approached it. As the king sat listening to petitions or issuing decrees, the quiet dignity of the court was shattered in an instant. Without warning, the throne, which had likely been poorly constructed or had become unstable over time, collapsed. The entire heavy wooden structure, including its massive canopy, came crashing down directly on top of the unsuspecting king. The royal court was thrown into immediate chaos. Attendants and guards would have rushed forward, frantically pulling away the splintered timber and heavy beams of the shattered throne to get to their fallen leader. But the weight and force of the collapse had been too great. The king was pulled from the wreckage, gravely injured. King was crushed and mortally wounded by the very seat of his power. He never recovered from the severe injuries he sustained, and he died shortly thereafter. The man known as the champion, a warrior who had risked his life in battle to win and secure his throne, was ultimately defeated by a bout of shoddy craftsmanship. The symbolism of his end is inescapable. To be killed by the collapse of one's own throne is an irony so thick it feels like something from a cautionary fable. It serves as a bizarre and darkly humorous footnote in the annals of medieval history, a grim reminder that a monarch's rule, no matter how strong, can be undone in the most unexpected of ways. For King B, the seat of power proved to be the most dangerous place in the entire kingdom. When a member of a royal family is condemned to death, the end is typically a grim but formal affair, a solemn procession to the executioner's block or a quiet death by the sword. But history, and especially legend, sometimes offers a far more creative and undignified exit. Such is the strange tale of George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, who, according to a persistent and spectacular rumor, was executed by being drowned in a barrel of his favorite wine. To understand this bizarre story, we must travel back to 15th century England, a time of brutal civil war known as the Wars of the Roses. George was the notoriously ambitious and treacherous brother of the Yorkist king, Edward IV. In a conflict defined by shifting loyalties, George was perhaps the most unreliable of them all, constantly scheming and switching his allegiance between his own brother and their Lancastrian enemies. After years of rebellion, forgiveness, and renewed plotting, George's luck finally ran out. In 1478, he was arrested and put on trial for high treason against his own brother, the king. He was found guilty and sentenced to death. It was the ultimate family tragedy. A king, tormented by years of betrayal, was forced to sign the death warrant for his own sibling. Because of his royal blood, the execution was to be carried out privately, away from the prying eyes of the public, within the stone walls of the Tower of London. This secrecy, intended as a final small mercy to a disgraced royal, is precisely what allowed the strange and enduring legend of his death to take root and flourish. The story, which was later immortalized by William Shakespeare, claims that George, upon being condemned, was granted a choice in the method of his own execution. Known throughout the court as a man who greatly enjoyed life's indulgences, particularly rich, sweet Malmsey wine, he is said to have made a final, bizarre request to be drowned in a massive barrel or butt of the very same wine. Picture the scene, if you can. A dark, cold chamber in the Tower of London. No axe, no block, just a massive wooden cask filled to the brim with fragrant, intoxicating wine. The condemned Duke of Clarence, a prince of the realm, meeting his end not with a prayer, but by being unceremoniously submerged in alcohol. It is an image of death that is as comical as it is grim. Now, most historians agree that this story is almost certainly a myth, a piece of black humor that likely arose from George's reputation as a heavy drinker. He was probably executed more conventionally, quickly, and quietly, but the legend was simply too colorful and too fitting for his character to fade away. It perfectly captured the perceived decadence and internal rot of the royal family. Whether by a blade in the shadows or by a barrel of wine, George of Clarence met his deserved end. But the legend has completely consumed the truth. His death is not remembered as a solemn state execution, but as one of the most unique and alcoholic exits in English history. A strangely fitting final chapter for a man who lived a life of treacherous indulgence. Not all embarrassing royal tales end in death. Some are stories of near-fatal foolishness, moments of such catastrophic misjudgment. Such is the horrifying story of King Charles VI of France, a ruler known as Charles the Mad, and the night his courtly entertainment turned into a fiery nightmare known as the Ball of the Burning Men. The stage for this tragedy was set in Paris in January of 1393. A grand masquerade ball was being held at the royal palace to celebrate the wedding of one of the queen's ladies-in-waiting. The court was in high spirits, ready for a night of dancing, music, and aristocratic amusement. King Charles, whose reign was already marked by episodes of severe mental illness, decided to contribute a special performance. For the evening's entertainment, the king and 5 of his closest noble companions devised a shocking and, they thought, humorous costume. They would dress as wild men of the woods. This involved being sewn into tight-fitting linen costumes, which were then coated in a sticky layer of pitch or resin. To this sticky base, they attached frayed strands of flax and hemp, creating a shaggy, fur-like appearance. They had, in effect, turned themselves into highly flammable human candles. Chained together to complete the spectacle, the 6 men burst into the ballroom, howling and dancing erratically like savage beasts. The assembled guests, unaware of the performers' true identities, were initially amused and intrigued by the chaotic display. The game was to try and guess which nobles were hidden beneath the bizarre, hairy costumes. The fun turned to horror in a single, careless moment. The king's brother, Louis, arrived late to the party with his uncle, the Duke of Berry. Curious to see who the wild men were, and likely more than a little drunk, they approached the dancers holding open-flame torches to get a better look. A spark from one of the torches touched one of the costumes. In an instant, the pitch and flax-covered dancer was engulfed in a column of fire. Because the men were chained together, the flames leaped from one to the next with terrifying speed. The ballroom, a moment before a scene of laughter, was transformed into a vision of hell. Screams of agony and panic filled the hall as the noble guests watched in horror as the men burned alive. The king himself was only saved by the quick thinking of his aunt, the Duchess of Berry. Recognizing him just in time, she threw the heavy train of her velvet gown over him, smothering the flames and saving his life. 4 of his 5 companions were not so fortunate, dying in excruciating pain from their burns over the next few days. The event, forever known as the Ball of the Burning Men, deeply traumatized the already fragile king, and his mental health declined sharply in its aftermath. It remains a horrifying testament to the perils of royal foolishness. Some rulers are born to greatness, while others seem almost tragically unsuited for the crowns placed upon their heads. Few fit into the latter category quite as perfectly as Tsar Peter III of Russia. His short, disastrous reign is a masterclass in how to alienate an entire empire, and his story ends, predictably, in betrayal and a suspicious death orchestrated by the one person who knew his weaknesses best: his own wife, the future Catherine the Great. Peter was the German-born heir to the Russian throne, and he made no secret of the fact that he despised his adopted country. He loathed the Russian language, the Orthodox Church, and the culture of the court. He was a deeply immature and infantile man who, even as Tsar, was famously obsessed with playing with toy soldiers, drilling his servants in military formations, and drinking to excess. He was, in short, a man-child in charge of a vast and powerful empire. His reign began in January of 1762 and lasted a mere 6 months. In that short time, he managed to offend nearly every powerful faction in Russia. His most catastrophic decision was to abruptly make peace with Prussia, Russia's hated enemy in the ongoing 7 Years' War. He not only ended the war, but idolized the Prussian king, Frederick the Great, effectively insulting the Russian army and throwing away all the sacrifices they had made. His intelligent and ambitious German wife, Catherine, saw the writing on the wall. She knew her husband's incompetence made her own position as Empress Consort dangerously insecure. With the support of the powerful Imperial Guard and the influential Orlov brothers, she orchestrated a swift and bloodless coup in July of the same year. Peter, who was away from the capital, discovered he had been deposed and lost his nerve completely. He was arrested without a single shot being fired and was forced to abdicate his throne. The failed Tsar was then taken to a rural estate called Ropsha to be held under guard, while Catherine consolidated her power in St. Petersburg. He was now a prisoner, waiting for a fate he was powerless to control. Just over a week later, the imperial court made a startling announcement. The former Tsar, Peter III, was dead. The official cause was listed as a severe attack of hemorrhoidal colic and an apoplectic stroke. This vague and frankly ridiculous explanation was met with widespread skepticism both in Russia and across Europe. It was simply too convenient. The true story, as pieced together by historians, is far grimmer. It is almost certain that Peter was murdered by his guards at Ropsha, likely strangled to death during a drunken brawl that was intentionally provoked by Alexei Orlov, the brother of Catherine's lover. While Catherine may not have directly ordered the assassination, it was a clumsy and brutal solution carried out by her supporters to eliminate the threat of a deposed Tsar. The official cause of death was just a final, undignified lie to cover the grim reality of a political murder. Our journey now takes us to the elegant and sophisticated world of late 19th century Paris, a time known as the Belle Epoque, or Beautiful Era. It was an age of art, culture, and refinement. But behind the gilded facade of the French Republic, the death of one of its leaders would become one of the most notorious and embarrassing scandals of the era. This is the story of President Faure. Faure was the president of France from 1895 to 1899, a period of immense political and social tension, most notably dominated by the divisive Dreyfus affair. As the head of state, Faure was expected to be a symbol of stability and moral rectitude, the dignified embodiment of the French Republic. His private life, however, would ultimately lead to a profoundly public and undignified end. The fateful day was February 16, 1899. The president was in his official residence, the Grand Palace in Paris. As the afternoon drew to a close, He was not in a cabinet meeting or signing state papers. Instead, he was in a private room known as the Blue Salon, engaged in a secret rendezvous. With him in the room was his mistress, a charismatic 30-year-old woman named Marguerite Steinheil. The president, a man approaching his 60s, was in the midst of this clandestine meeting when he was suddenly struck by a massive stroke. He collapsed in a state of partial undress, leaving his terrified companion in a state of absolute panic. When palace officials were finally summoned to the scene, they were met with chaos. They found their president dying, his clothes in disarray, with a hysterical Marguerite Steinheil beside him. A frantic effort was made to manage the situation, to rearrange the scene, and to construct a more respectable narrative before the press and the public could learn the truth. The official statement from the palace announced that the president had succumbed to a sudden cerebral congestion while working at his desk. But this was Paris, a city that thrives on gossip, and the truth, in all its scandalous glory, leaked out almost immediately. The city's newspapers, satirists, and café society exploded with lurid rumors, mocking poems, and dark jokes. One of his political rivals, Georges Clemenceau, delivered a famously cruel quip, saying of Foray, he wanted to be Caesar, but he ended up as Pompey, a vulgar pun that quickly made the rounds. The scandal was unstoppable. The image of the president dying in the arms of his mistress became a national joke, a piece of political theater that completely overshadowed his actual presidency. Foray is remembered today not for his policies or his role in the Dreyfus affair, but for the embarrassing and scandalous circumstances of his death. He became a permanent cautionary tale about the dangers of a politician's private life, a man whose final moments of indulgence led to a legacy of ridicule and a profoundly undignified place in history. Our long and strange journey through the back corridors of history is now drawing to a close. We have walked through the ages, visiting the final, undignified moments of kings, queens, emperors, and popes. We've seen lives built on an epic scale, filled with immense power and world-changing decisions, that ended not with a thunderous crash, but with a quiet and often embarrassing whisper. We have witnessed a king vanquished by a desert, an emperor defeated by his own temper, a conqueror brought low by a clumsy fall, and a feared warlord felled by a simple nosebleed. From a fatal monkey bite to a misplaced doorframe, these stories serve as a powerful and recurring reminder that for all the ceremony and splendor of royal life, death remains the great indiscriminate equalizer. What makes these tales so compelling is not just their strangeness, but their profound irony. An emperor, obsessed with achieving immortality, is poisoned by his own elixir. A king who adored his modern canons is blown up by one. A mighty ruler who fought wars to secure his throne is crushed by the very seat of his power. In these endings, history seems to have a dark and poetic sense of humor. These stories do more than entertain, they humanize. They strip away the crowns, the robes, and the carefully constructed legacies to reveal the fragile, fallible, and sometimes foolish person underneath. They show us that no amount of wealth or authority can protect a person from a random accident, a simple infection, or a single fatal moment of indulgence or distraction. Thank you for joining us on this quiet exploration of history's most peculiar final chapters. It has been a privilege to be your guide through these forgotten and often whispered about tales. We hope this journey has been a relaxing and intriguing one for you, wherever you may be listening in the world tonight. If you have enjoyed this calm and steady look at the stranger side of the past, please take a moment to subscribe to Medieval Nocturnes. Your support is what allows us to continue unearthing these stories for you. We would also love to hear from you in the comments. Let us know which of these bizarre endings you found the most unbelievable. And now, as our journey ends, let these stories begin to fade. Let the details soften and blur into the background. The halls of history are growing quiet once more. The great and the powerful are at rest, their strange and surprising stories now told. May your own night be peaceful, may your mind be calm, and may your rest be deep and untroubled. Until we meet again for another quiet journey into the past, from all of us here at Medieval Nocturnes, sleep well.